Hello and welcome. Thanks for attending this Daoist Foundation remote talk. My name is Komjathy. My primary Daoist name is Jing, Cultivating Stillness. With Kate Townsend, I'm the founding co-director and senior teacher of the Daoist Foundation, a nonprofit Daoist religious and educational organization dedicated to fostering authentic Daoist study and practice, and to preserving and transmitting traditional Daoist culture. In the Daoist tradition, we refer to these types of meetings and talks as Lundao. Lundao literally means discussing the Tao, with the Tao being the sacred and ultimate concern of Daoists. It is a Daoist conversation about the Tao, Daoist practice realization, and/or the Daoist tradition. It may be a formal discourse, something akin to a Zen Buddhist Dharma talk, or a communal discussion. It may be an abbot's lecture, formal spiritual direction, and even drinking tea together. This is because any meeting between Daoists always is about the Tao in some respect, remembering the sacred, maintaining a sacred orientation. In our approach, Lundao usually includes both a formal talk and more open discussion. For these meetings, I want to talk about some foundational topics that may be of more general interest. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So for this Lundao, I want to discuss the Daoist tradition, with a specific focus on developing an informed and nuanced understanding of Daoism as an indigenous Chinese and now global religion. So thinking about the Daoist tradition as such, the characters here are Dao Tong, so literally the tradition of the Tao. The first character is Dao, which we'll talk about more in a moment. It has the Chuo, move or walk radical, and Tong, the second character, has the Mi, or silk radical. So that's on the left side of the characters. So these relate to movement and connection. We also might think of Tong in the sense of identification and Tong as connection. So what is our connection to this tradition? How are we located in relationship to it? The first point is that Chinese Daoism, so this indigenous Chinese religious tradition, is the source tradition. We now have global Daoism, which is characterized by cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity. And that includes us, whoever we are. So we have various backgrounds and locations, but if we're connected to this tradition, then there's a kind of question of our backgrounds, our location, and how that relates to the larger Chinese tradition or Chinese Daoism as the source tradition. Although Dao Tong is conventionally used to refer to Ruism, so-called Confucianism, I use it to encompass both Dao Jia, the family of the Dao, and Dao Jiao, the teachings of the Dao, or classical and organized Daoism respectively, which I'll talk about in a moment. These are referred to as so-called philosophical Daoism, strike through, and so-called religious Daoism, strike through, in outdated and inaccurate discussions of Daoism. So my use of Dao Tong to designate the Daoist tradition is part of a larger Daoist retrievalist and visionary project. So let's begin with some foundational understanding of Daoism. Daoism is the tradition of the Tao, so this is the modern Mandarin pronunciation of this character. That character is an indigenous Chinese Daoist theological designation, by which I mean the sacred, for what is considered sacred and ultimately real by Daoist. Tao is not a universal name, so we can compare this to terms like mystery, one, or silence, which would be more accurate from a comparative perspective, or thinking about a way in which somebody might use a more general term for a sacred like the Tao. But the Tao is a Taoist theological category. To invoke it is to invoke the Taoist tradition on some level. Daoism is an indigenous Chinese religion, deeply rooted in traditional Chinese culture. So it is an indigenous Chinese religion. It is a religious tradition, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. Daoism begins as a religious community with the inner cultivation lineages of classical Daoism around 300 BCE and becomes an organized religion around 142 CE. So the reason that I've italicized religious community here is because there's a lot of misunderstanding about Daoism, both generally as a tradition, but also in terms of its origins, where people will talk about it as a philosophy. But it's quite clearly religious. And what I mean by that is that there is a shared worldview, and that worldview includes a shared theological view. So that is the Tao as the sacred. It has a shared soteriology or ultimate purpose of human existence, which emphasizes alignment, attunement, realization of the Tao. There's a shared training regimen or repertoire of practice that I'll talk about more in a moment, and at some future Lundaos, which is apophatic and quietistic meditation or stillness and emptiness-based meditation. Daoism is now a global religious community rooted in and transcending Chinese Daoism, quote unquote, as source tradition. Global Daoism is characterized by cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity, and that includes us, whoever we are, whatever our backgrounds are, if we're associated with the tradition. There's a spectrum of engagement and connection, and so this is quite complex, but the way I tend to think about it is from transmission through adaptation to appropriation, and this includes a rhetoric of tradition and lineage. So what I mean by that is many things that are being presented as Daoism, quote unquote, or Daoist, quote unquote, use this rhetoric of, oh, this is traditional, or this comes from this particular lineage. But when you investigate it, there is no real connection with the Daoist tradition as such. There's also this Daoist emphasis on predestined affinity, yuan fun, mystical experience, revelation, and reincarnation. And reincarnation is not an indigenous Chinese view. It's influenced by Indian culture, by Indian traditions, and specifically by Buddhism. But one of the points here is that the connection to Daoism might come from beyond this historical moment or this particular moment in time. There can be other sources of influence. And Daoists recognize this. So it's not as simple as just saying like somebody was ordained or somebody has some kind of formal affiliation with the tradition in a kind of conventional temporal or social sense. Daoists are adherents of Daoism, so there's a spectrum of participation, including affiliates and adherents to sympathizers. So by affiliates, I use it in a more technical sense of people with formal standing or more formal connection with the tradition. Adherents could be really anyone who self-identifies as a Daoist. And sympathizers are people who might find something interesting about Daoism or have some part of Daoism is relevant to their lives, but they don't think of themselves as Daoist per se. Okay? This relates to ordination and lineage. And the reason I put not required here is that that's a kind of common assumption or I think misunderstanding about Daoism, that you have to be ordained or you have to have lineage. And I'll talk about that more in a moment as well. But there is Daoist ordination and lineage. So this usually involves initiation, transmission, sometimes even formal ritual. And that's what makes one a Daoisher, a Daoist priest, or a Daoist monastic. And that's gender inclusive. So men and women can be Daoist priests or Daoist monastics. So those would be more affiliates. So obviously the majority of Daoists are not that. The majority of Daoists are adherents. Okay? And from my perspective, ordination in particular is a vocation. It's a calling. It's not an identity marker, right? It's not a legitimation construction. So that would be a different talk altogether. But it's a certain set of responsibilities and obligations, right? That some people may have an affinity with and some people may not. But this is getting clouded over by the use of ordination and lineage in terms of legitimation in the modern world. There's also no orthodoxy in Daoism. This is a modern construct. Orthodoxy refers to true or correct belief. So Daoism does not have a kind of set worldview that requires rigid adherence to it. It's not dogmatic. So there, of course, is a Taoist worldview. There are Taoist principles. There are Taoist values. But it's not a kind of mandated form of belief like other traditions. So it's, again, not dogmatic. So I prefer to talk about tradition-based Taoism rather than orthodox, and also not necessarily even traditional, quote unquote. And the reason to use this term is to bring our attention to the fact that there is a source tradition, Chinese Taoism, that is an indigenous Chinese religion. And so there's a question of the connection to that, the relationship of that. So thinking about the Tao as a Taoist theological category, the etymology of the Tao is the left side of the character is the radical chuo, that means to move or to walk, and the right side is shou, head, so human head. Other earlier character variants both had xing in it, so that's another kind of movement or walking character. One has ren, human, in the middle, and the other one has the same shou, head, in the middle. So all of these characters have this connotation of movement through the world, and thus way or path. And what's interesting is from a historical perspective, this was a common term or category in the Warring States period. So that's 480 to 222 BCE. And so we remember that Taoism begins around 300 BCE. So in the context of the Warring States period into the early Han Dynasty, various individuals and communities, and you might even say emerging traditions, were discoursing on the Tao. But what they meant was their particular Taos, their particular ways, their particular paths. So the way of Ruism or the way of legalism. And what's really interesting in terms of Taoist history is Taoists take this kind of term and they make it into a theological category. So we can also think about this as a polemic. That is, that Taoists are recognizing that all of these people are arguing or discussing this character, and they say, yes, you're all talking about your particular Taos, your small ways, but we're more interested in the way. So we can talk about the Tao as a character, or Tao as character, as both a way with a lowercase w and the way with an uppercase w. And so, of course, from a Taoist perspective, Taoism is the way with a lowercase w to the way with an uppercase w. It is Taoism as a life way, as a path towards the Tao. One of the most famous discussions of the Tao is chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power. This is a very complicated text, and it would take a whole nother talk to kind of go through the history of it. But the earliest name for the text is the Lao Tzu, the Book of Venerable Masters, which is conventionally translated as the Book of Master Lao. But Lao Tzu is a legendary figure. He did not write the Tao Te Ching. He's not connected to the Tao Te Ching. It's pretty clear now that he didn't exist. So what we have to do is talk about the received Tao Te Ching as a multivocal anthology with material dating from the 4th to the 2nd century BCE. It contains anonymous teachings and practices associated with various elders of the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism. So it doesn't have a single author. It doesn't have a single voice. It's probably best to think of it as a kind of collective wisdom text where these various Taoists are talking about Taoist practice, Taoist realization, Taoist views, and so on. So this chapter is probably the most influential on the way that Taoists think of the Tao. So the first 2 lines, so we're reading from top to bottom, right to left, which is the way classical Chinese is written and read. This is also the traditional way of reading Taoist literature. And so it's unpunctuated. The main difference here is that I've lineated it. So you can kind of see there's a lot of more parallelism in it if it was laid out in a different way. So this is my translation. The Tao that can be spoken is not the constant Tao. The name that can be named is not the constant name. Nameless, the beginning of the heavens and earth. Named, the mother of the 10,000 beings. Thus, constantly desireless, one may observe its subtlety. Constantly desiring, one may observe its boundaries. These two emerge from sameness, but differ in name. This sameness is called mysterious. Mysterious and again more mysterious, the gateway to all that is wondrous. So in Chinese, the first two lines say Dao ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao, Ming ke Ming, Fei Chang Ming. And then the last two lines say Xuan zhi you xuan, Zhong miao zhi men. So you can see and hear that there's a repetition of characters. So in the first line, Dao ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao, the first, third, and sixth characters are the Dao. And it can mean, again, way with a lowercase w or way with an uppercase w. So as a Daoist theological category or term, we usually leave it untranslated with an uppercase D as Dao. But it can also mean to speak or to tell. So literally the way that can be weighed or the Dao that can be Dao is not the constant way or Dao. So that is, Dao is just a placeholder for what's ultimately real, for what's sacred. Okay, so even the character or even the name has to be abandoned. And then they tell us a little bit about how names function here. But for our purposes, what's more important is the last two lines that say Xuan zhi you xuan, Zhong miao zhi men. So you can see there's a repetition of the Xuan character, mystery, mysteriousness, and also sometimes it's translated as dark or darkness. So what's interesting about this particular grammatical construction is it literally says something like even more mysterious than mysterious. So Taoists will oftentimes talk about this as the twofold mystery of the Tao. The Tao even more mysterious than mysteriousness. And then it becomes a gate, a portal into everything that's subtle or everything that's wondrous. So we have to move into this state of open receptivity, of accepting that we don't know, to allow the Tao to unfold, to encounter it as it is in its own suchness, Tsaran. So here, one thing to just kind of think about as well is that these terms also become used as other names for the Tao, or non-names really. So sometimes the Tao is talked about as Xuan itself, the mystery, or Miao itself, the wondrous. The Tao, and the reason it's in scare quotation marks again, is because it's just a placeholder, right, for what's sacred as a Taoist cosmological and theological category. And so here, cosmology and theology are used in a more technical kind of comparative sense of the underlying principles, patterns, and structure of the universe and what is sacred. So from a traditional Taoist perspective, the Tao has four primary characteristics: the source of everything, Yuan, an unnameable mystery, Xuan, which we just saw in Jing chapter 1, an all-pervading sacred presence, Ling, and the universe as a transformative process, or nature, Hua. So from a Taoist perspective, everything comes from the Tao. The Tao is the source. Other texts talk about the Tao as the ancestor, Zong, or the mother, Mu. So this is also in the Jing. But in the context of this, it's the view that there is this source of everything, okay? So it doesn't have agency, it doesn't have intentionality from a traditional Taoist perspective, but there is this kind of primordial moment when non-differentiation started to change and emerge into differentiation. And I'll talk about that at another Lundao. It's also an unnameable mystery. So this is obviously a contradiction because we're using names here. So even to say it's unnameable is a description of it. But the point here is that it's beyond our categories. It's beyond our understanding. It's beyond any language. So it is beyond. It's an all-pervading sacred presence. So here I use the technical term of Ling that a lot of times is translated as numinous or numinosity, but this relates to qi, right? So subtle breath or energy. And here, what this is really about is that it's an energetic view of the universe, of the world, of ourselves, that there's some kind of divine or sacred presence moving through everything, circulating through everything. So this is one of the ways that Taoists connect with the Tao and experience the Tao and also experience Taoist being. And then the universe is a transformative process. So you might know like the traditional Chinese worldview of yin and yang and the 5 phases. But here it's just this broader sense of everything is changing into something else, right? So composition, decomposition, recomposition, and so on, just never ending transformative process. So the only constant from a Taoist perspective is change, and not in the Buddhist sense of impermanence, but in the sense of like, this is all the Tao unfolding as a natural process. There are also a lot of indigenous Chinese names for Taoism, right? So what do we mean, right, when we kind of think about Taoism in a bilingual way? Obviously, Daojia and Daojiao, which I'll talk about, are the kind of more common names that are invoked, but there's a lot. So Buyan Zhijiao, this is in the Tao Te Ching, the teaching beyond or without words. This is usually read in context as just kind of a general term for, or a general phrase talking about, what the anonymous elders of the Tao Te Ching are emphasizing, right? We're more interested in a teaching beyond words, some kind of practice-based and experiential understanding of the world. But I increasingly think this is actually one of the earliest Taoist designations for something like Taoism. So obviously Tao is not here, but it's assumed, because we just saw that in Tao Te Ching chapter 1, that when we talk about the teaching beyond words, we're talking about something that's pointing us towards what's ultimately real, what the sacred is. So there's a way to read this as an actual kind of proto-Taoist name for Taoism, the teaching beyond or without words. Daojia, the family of the Tao, and Daojiao, the teachings of the Tao that I mentioned before, these are oftentimes misunderstood and misrepresented as so-called philosophical Taoism, so-called religious Taoism, but there's nothing about philosophy and religion in these terms. They both have a pretty complex history, but I prefer to kind of think of them as overlapping, having a kind of complementary relationship. But the other thing to think about is the historical use of the terms and what are they designating. So if we want to use them in a conventional way, Daojia, the family of the Tao, is more like classical Taoism, and Daojiao, the teachings of the Tao, is more like organized Taoism, but it's actually more complex than that. Dao Shu, so obviously this isn't Taoism, quote unquote, but the techniques of the Tao, it's also translated as the arts of the way. And I'm going to show you this in a moment, that this is one of the earlier Taoist names for people doing Taoist practice. Right? So they'll say, okay, these people, us as Taoists, practice Dao Shu, practice techniques of the Tao. And that's what kind of makes us Taoists, even though they don't say we are Taoists. Dao Tong, which I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the tradition of the Tao, this is usually invoked as a reference to Confucianism, so-called Confucianism. So I prefer Ruism as a revisionist way of thinking about that tradition, which is more in keeping with the indigenous understanding of it. But in any case, Dao Tong, the tradition of the Tao, is Taoism. It's not Ruism. So yes, it's true that late medieval Ruism basically started to think about the Tao in Taoist terms, and there's some polemical and political elements of this as well. But to really kind of say, when we talk about Dao Tong, we're talking about Taoism. Or Dao Xue, the study of the Tao. So you might have heard that term that gets approximated in English as so-called Neo-Confucianism as way learning or something like that. But again, in my Taoist retrievalist and kind of visionary project, this too is about Taoism. So we can talk about Taoism as Dao Xue, as the study of the Tao or way learning. Gu Dao, the way of the ancients, or Gu Zhi Dao. So Zhi is just a kind of possessive. Gu Dao, the way of the ancients. You also find this in classical Taoist texts, and this is used outside of Taoist texts as well. But in that context, it looks like they're really talking about there's this lineage or there's this community that they think of as a particular way. So Gu Dao can also mean the ancient Tao or the way of antiquity. But I think here they're also talking about that we have this kind of elder-based community that's rooted in practice and transmission. Qingjing Wu Wei Dao, so you might have heard of Wu Wei, non-action. This phrase becomes especially important and emphasized in early Chenjin, in early complete perfection Taoism that I'll talk about in a moment. But Qingjing and Wu Wei are two key classical Taoist phrases and values. So usually Qingjing is clarity and stillness, but here I've rendered it as a kind of phrase of clear stillness, and Wu Wei, non-action. So these classical and foundational Taoist values and practices that then become a way to think about Taoism more generally as the path, right? Emphasizing clarity and stillness and non-action. Shengren Zhi Dao, so this is like Gu Dao or Gu Zhi Dao. This is also in classical Taoism. So the way of the sages. So there's a way to read this as this is a kind of indigenous classical Taoist understanding of being a member of that community, that we're following the teachings of the sages. So that would be contained in texts like the Lauds of the Book of Venerable Masters, with the aspiration to become a sage, so a kind of realized Taoist. And here, one of the reasons to point this out is that you have these terms that are functioning like an early Taoist self-identification. So there's a kind of sense of community, a sense of affiliation, a sense of an emerging tradition that these terms, I think, approximate. And of course, this is debatable, but this is part of the research I'm doing at the moment. Xuan Feng, mysterious movement, and Xuan Man, mysterious gate. So Xuan Feng literally means mysterious wind. We saw this in Tao Te Ching 1, that Xuan is another name for the Tao. So what is Taoism, right? It's the movement, or it's the current infused by the Tao as mystery, or a gate, or a portal into the Tao. So these are two passages from the Zhuangzi, the Book of Master Zhuang. Again, a very complicated text. It wasn't written by Zhuangzi. So again, we should think about it as a multivocal anthology containing material from at least the 4th century to the 2nd century BCE. And so the first one is important because it's in the inner chapters, and the inner chapters, chapters 1 through 7, are generally considered to be the earliest, probably a lot of it coming from the Warring States period. And so the fact that we have a reference to Dao Shu, what I mentioned before, the techniques of the Tao, is important here. It's not just in the later parts of the text. It's in probably the earliest strata. So Zhuangzi chapter 6 tells us, fish thrive in water, humans thrive in the Tao. For those who thrive in water, dig a pond and they will find nourishment enough. For those who thrive in the Tao, don't bother about them and their lives will be secure. So it is said, fish forget each other in rivers and lakes. Humans forget each other through the techniques of the Tao, or arts of the way, as I said before, Dao Shu. So then we have another occurrence of Dao Shu in Zhuangzi chapter 33, which is the last chapter. And interestingly, in this chapter, there is a much stronger sense of a kind of self-identified Taoist community, emerging sense of tradition, and so on. So they tell us to regard the root as pure and things as coarse, to look upon accumulation as insufficiency, dwelling alone, tranquil and placid, in spiritual illumination. There were those in ancient times who held that the techniques of the Tao lay in these things. Past guardian Yin, Yin Shi, and Lao Dan, Lao Tzu heard their currents and delighted in them. They established them through constant non-being and being, and mastered them through great unity. Gentle weakness and humble self-effacement are its outer marks. Emptiness and non-injury of the myriad beings are its substance. So there are a few things I want to point out about these passages that's important for understanding the Taoist tradition, especially the emergence of the Taoist tradition in the Warring States period into the early Han. And one is they're talking about Taoism in terms of practice. There are techniques of the Tao, right? So specifically apophatic and quietistic meditation, so stillness and emptiness based meditation. There are methods to attune oneself with the Tao. So this is Taoism as a system of spiritual cultivation and transformation. And if we read this carefully, we find a couple things. So both Yin Shi and Lao Dan are pseudo-historical, they're legendary. But in this context, so again, the dating is somewhat complicated, but let's just say around 200 BCE, so about 100 years after the kind of formative moments of classical Taoism, you have these Taoists basically formulating a presentation of their tradition, of the Taoist tradition, according to specific people and specific practices. So they're thinking about the community and the tradition this way. They identify like key markers, right? So the outer markers, right? And the substance, the outer marks and the substance of it. So there are these kinds of shared values, but also this idea of lineage, of community, that it's passing through teachers and students. And so traditionally, Lao Dan or Lao Tzu is said to have transmitted the Tao Te Ching to Yin Shi. So, right, this is, again, mythological, this is legendary, but in the context of this text, we can see Taoists thinking about the way they're understanding the transmission of the Tao through Taoism. So this is from my books, The Daoist Tradition and Introduction, and Taoism Guide for the Perplexed. So these two kind of introductions to the Taoist tradition as a whole. So in place of this kind of outdated and inaccurate construction of Taoism as like bifurcated, that is, there's like so-called philosophical Taoism and so-called religious Taoism strike through, and also the kind of later kind of truncated or Strickmannian view that Taoism really starts with the celestial masters, which also doesn't hold up to critical scrutiny. I want to suggest an alternative interpretive framework. And so this focuses on what I call the 7 periods and the 4 divisions. The 7 periods is really to bring attention to the diversity of Taoism in different historical periods, obviously in traditional Chinese history. And the 4 divisions are more about social organization. So I'll explain what I mean here. So first, the 7 periods, and I've given you the time frames for them. Classical Taoism, early Taoism, early medieval Taoism, late medieval Taoism, late imperial Taoism, early modern Taoism, and late modern Taoism. And there's a reason to split modern Taoism this way. And then if you look at the 4 divisions, classical Taoism becomes classical Taoism, early Taoism and early medieval Taoism become early organized Taoism, late medieval Taoism, late imperial Taoism become later organized Taoism, and then obviously early modern and late modern become modern Taoism. So I'll talk about the kind of differences in a moment, but the kind of key thing here is there are major shifts happening, right? So in classical Taoism, we primarily have these inner cultivation lineages. So these master-disciple communities that are only loosely affiliated with each other. Sometimes they're interacting, as far as we can tell, sometimes they're actually doing certain kinds of projects together, but they're only loosely affiliated. So you don't have a kind of clear social organization there other than kind of these grassroots communities focused on specific teachers, okay? When you move into early Taoism and therefore early organized Taoism, this is the shift into the kind of 4 major movements of early organized Taoism are Tianshi, the Celestial Masters, Tai Chi, Great Clarity, Shangqi, Highest Clarity, and Lingbao, Numinous Treasure. There's a greater social organization. There starts to be formal Taoist communities, emerging institutions, a sense of kind of Taoist identity, also ritual. And one of the things that we can talk about here is also a sense in Taoism about kind of forming a theocracy. So in this case, it would be more of like a Taoocracy, that is rule by the Tao. And what I mean by that is having projects where you're actually having the community oriented toward the Tao and thinking about it as being infused with this kind of Taoist worldview, this Taoist belief system that's theologically infused. When you move into later organized Taoism, and specifically Chenjen, complete perfection, but it's more complicated, but because it actually starts to happen more in the Tang Dynasty and even before, you get a kind of formal system of Taoist monasticism, right? And so that's starting primarily in the Tang, although you have things that precede that, and then kind of culminating in Chenjen. The reason that I say that is that Chenjen is one of the 2 forms of institutional Taoism that survives into the modern world. Longman, Dragon Gate is the primary lineage of Chenjen, complete perfection in the modern world. And then modern Taoism, and modern Taoism is primarily, at least on an institutional level, Tianshi, that's also referred to as Zhengyi, Orthodox Unity, and Chenjen, complete perfection tradition. The reason that I've split the modern period in the 7 periods this way is because we have to kind of talk about the end of traditional China, the end of dynastic rule. So that's like 1912. And then basically the communist takeover in 1949, the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, and then the reforms of modern China in 1978. And this leads to increased religious freedom. So that's somewhat debatable, but that is the case. especially constitutionally speaking in mainland China and the People's Republic of China. And then what happens after 1978, and this is also the emergence of global Daoism from my perspective. So there are many movements in Taoist history, and I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. I just want to kind of bring our awareness to them. I just went through how these relate to the 7 periods and the 4 divisions. So the inner cultivation lineages, right? Classical Taoism, primarily focused on master-disciple communities, emphasizing apophatic meditation and realizing the Tao. Taiping, Great Peace, and Tianshi, the Celestial Masters, are the 2 major kind of movements of early Taoism and the beginning of kind of organized Taoism, so early organized Taoism here. The reason the Tianshi and Quanzhen are asterisks is because these become the kind of most influential movements, and in a certain way almost like normative, although this is somewhat complicated in terms of their relationships to each other. But we can talk about the Tianshi just briefly, which is they start out as this kind of regional community in what is now Sichuan and the kind of surrounding area. They want a kind of Taoist state. It's overseen by the Celestial Master himself. And yes, it is patrilineal and patriarchal that way. And then it basically passes from father to son, usually. It can also be to grandson, and sometimes it varies from that. But then it becomes this highly organized kind of Taoist state that are based on Taoist values. Interestingly, there's an emphasis on the Tao Te Ching. It appears to be some practices and principles derived from the Tao Te Ching that were then applied more broadly as precepts and so on. Tai Ching, Great Clarity, Shang Ching, Highest Clarity, and Lingdao, Numinous Treasure are the most important early medieval movements. Tai Ching is primarily about external alchemy. Waidan. Shang Ching is more about kind of visualization practice, ingestion practice, but also a kind of ecstatic flight. So it's a lot more about kind of self-cultivation and getting into these ecstatic states and these relationships. So Shang Ching started out with a series of revelations from the Shang Ching, the highest clarity heaven. Lingbao, Numinous Treasure, is more of a ritualistic tradition. It's got some connections to Tai Ching. So it's quite complicated. You get things like talismans here being really important, kind of interventionist ritual, but also the kind of beginning of a strong Buddhist influence on Taoism. So the emergence of a kind of bodhisattva model, universal compassion and wisdom, but also universal salvation. So more of a kind of compassion-based Taoism. Tang Dynasty monasticism is what I was alluding to before. So this standardization of Taoism that becomes like basically monastic ranks and ordination ranks associated with particular earlier parts of the tradition. And so this is a kind of standardization and systematization of Taoism. So there are some earlier attempts this way, like Lu Xiu Jing, which you can look up if you're interested. But what you really get here is the kind of merging together of a lot of the earlier forms of Taoism into a more kind of cohesive tradition. As we move into the late Tang and early Song dynasty, you have the Zhonglu textual tradition of internal alchemy. So these are these legendary figures, Zhongli Tran and Ludong Bin, so it's named after 2 kind of key figures. They're semi-legendary. Zhongli Tran is quite obscure. Ludong Bin, we have at least some evidence that he might have existed, but he's still an obscure Taoist immortal. But these texts are the kind of earliest formulations or expressions of what we talk about as internal alchemy, Neidan. Quanzhen, I've already mentioned, complete perfection. It's also translated as total reality or complete reality, and so on. But I prefer perfection because of the emphasis on internal alchemy. Quanzhen started out as a kind of local and then regional ascetic, alchemical, and mystical movement. It then becomes a monastic order, and it reasons its asterisk is it continues to this day as the kind of primary form of Daoist monasticism. There are lay initiates, but it's primarily a monastic order. And so what you have then, which is interesting in terms of modern Taoism, is the Tianshi or Zhengyi Orthodox Unity and Quanzhen Complete Perfection as offering these 2 paths. One that's more of a householder community-based kind of ritual model, that's the Celestial Masters, and one that's more monastic, renunciant model that's complete perfection. And then Nanzong. So Nanzong is a complicated name because it really encompasses a whole bunch of only loosely connected internal alchemy teachers and quasi-lineages. But if you're following the history of it, what you notice here is that we're basically ending at the Song Dynasty on the previous slide. And so what this means is that from this point forward, I mean, there are some ritual movements and some other kinds of movements that are happening. But what you're getting then is a kind of cohesive tradition that's being expanded and developed in different ways from really the Song Dynasty into the Yuan on. So we can then talk about Taoist identity and locatedness. And one of the reasons to show you this is to have us think about tradition in this way. So of course you have Taoists. So that's also the self. It could be you, it could be me, depending on how we locate ourselves in relationship to Taoism. But in terms of the individual Taoist adherent, there are many ways that they could be located in the tradition, right? So they could be connected to the Tao as the outermost circle. Presumably they're inside of Taoism on some level because they're a Taoist. So that's the next kind of circle. But then they also could be part of one of those movements I just showed you, and they could even be part of lineages. So lineages are somewhat complicated, but lineage could be just like a formal relationship to a particular teacher or a particular community. But a lot of times it's formalized through initiations and ordination and transmission, that then you literally are a member of a lineage, okay? So we also sometimes refer to movements as schools or sub-traditions. And if you're using my earlier language in terms of the Tao, these would be other ways through the way of Taoism to the way of the Tao. So this is an example of lineages. And these are formal lineages. So in Quanzhen and Complete Perfection, the history of these lineages is somewhat hard to date, but it looks like they really emerged in the late imperial period, and then they're obviously prominent in modern Taoism. So Quanzhen, Complete Perfection, becomes divided into 7 primary or major lineages that are associated with the so-called 7 perfected of early Quanzhen. So even though they are honorifically associated with those figures, they weren't founded by them, okay? So this is more of a late imperial kind of formulation of lineage affiliation. So you have Huashan Mount Hua, which is a quite small lineage. And part of the reason to put this up here is that's the lineage we're connected to. So it's not just Mount Hua. All of these are something pai. So Huashan pai, Longman pai, Qingjing pai, etc. So they all have pai there, which means you have to add lineage. So the Huashan lineage. And the reason to tell you that is because most of the Taoists living on Huashan, on Mount Hua in Shanxi province in the kind of central western part of China are actually Longman Taoists. So there's a distinction between Huashan Daoshi, Taoist priests or Taoist monastics at Huashan who are living at Huashan, and Huashan Pai Daoshi, so Taoist priests or Taoist monastics that are part of the Huashan lineage. Okay. Longman Dragon Gate is the largest and most influential of the Quanzhen lineages. It's associated with Qiuquji, the 3rd patriarch of early Quanzhen Taoism, and the kind of last surviving senior disciple of the founder Wang Zhe. So here, actually, it's Wang Changyue, this figure that is basically in the 17th century, who starts the formal official Longman lineage. And we have a lot of work being done on that. And so we have more knowledge about that particular lineage. Qingjing Pai, the reason I put this up here, the clarity and stillness lineage, is because it's the only one that's a Quandao lineage. It's specifically associated with Sun Bu'er, the only senior female member of the early Quanzhen movement. And so if you're talking about the place of women, women can be members of all of these lineages, but the Qingjing lineage, the clarity and stillness lineage, is specifically a Quandao, a female Taoist lineage. And then what's interesting is and this is what I was alluding to with the kind of Song Dynasty connection and moving out, is that it's branching out into these lineages. So from Longman, you get Wu Liu, the Wu Liu sublineage of Longman. So This is named after Wu Shouyang and Liu Huayang, these two kind of figures. Actually, Wu Shouyang was a Longman Daoist. Liu Huayang was a Buddhist, a Chan Buddhist primarily. And so when you kind of combine this, there's this lineage coming out of Longman that's a sublineage. And then you have the Qianfeng, the Thousand Peaks sublineage of the Wu Liu sublineage. And the reason I put this here is a lot of people might be familiar, not necessarily with the name Qianfeng, but with the founder of it, and the kind of key representative is Zhao Bichun. So he's pretty well known in the West because of Charles Luk or Lu Kuan Yu, who translated one of his key works, this is Zhao Bichun's works, as Daoist Yoga. So the title, the translation is inaccurate, but a lot of people know about the Qianfeng internal alchemy system through this Zhao Bichun text. And when we kind of trace this, what it's showing us is their lineages, their sublineages, their even sublineages of that. So we can talk about these through this Taoist water metaphor. And if you've read the Tao Te Ching carefully, you see how central water is, and then you can find other water connections throughout classical Taoism in the larger tradition. So one way that I like to think about this is Taoism is the river returning to the ocean of the Tao. Movements are streams flowing out of and into the river of tradition, while lineages are tributaries flowing out of and into the streams of movements. Each ultimately emerges from and returns to the ocean of the Tao. So again, thinking about the Tao as a way and the ways that we connect with and return to that way. Another helpful approach to understanding Taoism is to use these models of Taoist practice and attainment. Again, these are from my introductions to Taoism. So why? Because Taoism is so complex and diverse that you can kind of get lost in the specifics and not be able to make sense of like larger patterns or larger models. So these are just some, there would be many more, but alchemical, ascetic, cosmological, dietetic, ethical, hermeneutical, meditative, quietistic, ritualistic. So I'm not going to go through all of this. You can kind of look at it on your own, think about it. But part of it is to kind of have us think about our own aspirations, our own affinities, how we locate ourselves in relationship to the tradition. But also because a lot of times people are teaching from one of these perspectives. That could be academic, that could be from a practice-based perspective, including Taoist teachers, and they're not necessarily telling you this is where it's coming from, or this is why they're saying what they're saying. So you can get confused because it sounds contradictory, and it could be because of the type of model that's being used. So here's an example of this, is like we primarily use a quietistic model. So that's focusing on non-action, Wu Wei, involving non-interference, non-intervention, effortlessness essential, but also Wu Wei as coming out of an apophatic and quietistic practice. So emptiness and stillness based practice. So it's informed by and informs that practice. And then using that paired with a meditative model, obviously with meditation, especially stillness meditation being central, and then also cosmological attunement with ascetic or alchemical secondary piece, but not really ritualistic. So sometimes you'll have people in a ritualistic model talking about a quietistic approach, and they won't necessarily understand what the view is from a quietistic perspective. The same is true from an alchemical perspective. So a lot of people are practicing internal alchemy, but internal alchemy is progressive, right? It's based on this idea that you make spiritual progress through practice with a goal in mind, and a particular goal at that, like hypothetically becoming immortal. From a quietistic perspective, we're not doing that. We're returning to what we fundamentally are. So you can explain an alchemical approach from a quietistic perspective. You can explain a quietistic approach from an alchemical perspective, but they may or may not be complementary, right? They could actually be contradictory, or they could challenge each other. So this is largely about our own contemplative inquiry, how we think about what it is we're trying to do. So returning back to that Taoist identity and locatedness, now we can kind of think about the question of being a Taoist. So we were talking about the Taoist tradition more generally, right? That Taoist adherents or Taoist lineages are inside of potentially movements, inside of Taoism, ideally inside of the Tao. But then there's the actual self. the individual person, so us, so me and you. So are we most interested in the Tao? Are we located inside of Taoism? Are we part of a particular movement? Are we part of a particular lineage? Does that matter? Okay. So this is more about Taoist religious identity. Again, thinking about being a Taoist as an adherent of Taoism, not someone who follows the Tao. That would be more of a Taoist sympathizer from a tradition-based perspective. And as I said, one thing that I think really needs to be emphasized is if people are denying and denigrating Taoism as an indigenous Chinese religion, then they're really denying their own claims about identity or affiliation. So this, of course, is complicated because where do we draw the line? And I'm not interested in drawing the lines. I'm more interested in having people think about this for themselves and coming to some kind of like critical and informed perspective. But we'll just take an example. So if someone is thinking about their lives in terms of the Tao and kind of has that Taoist theological viewpoint, if they're reading the Tao Te Ching, trying to practice the Tao Te Ching, apply the Tao Te Ching, so the scripture on the Tao and inner power, if they're doing Taoist meditation, right, is that kind of sufficient? Does that make one a Taoist? So possibly, right? And some of this is about kind of self-understanding or self-identification. But there is the question that we're exploring here about the relationship to Taoism as a religious tradition. And again, what I want to encourage you to do is go through a contemplative inquiry and a critical reflection of your own, and obviously not get lost in identity questions, but just think about what is your connection? What is your affiliation? What are your interests? So some problematic views about being a Taoist, which are increasingly being disseminated on the internet. So this is one reason to talk about this. These are oftentimes advanced or put forward by individuals with questionable standing or even more problematic views about Taoism. I'm not interested in naming names or going through specific examples, but there are now all these books on Taoist identity, sometimes about from a kind of like autobiographical perspective. And a lot of these are quite confused and confusing, and I mean that on multiple levels. So one issue that comes up here is a question of authority, right? Who should we accept as an authority? So again, I think that's a kind of critical reflection that each person needs to go through. So some problematic views about being a Taoist include that Taoist identity requires being Chinese, whether ethnically and or culturally, right? And that Chinese Taoists, quote unquote, are superior to other Taoists, so non-Chinese, quote unquote, Taoists. This is a form of ethnocentrism. It's actually quite common in mainland Chinese Taoism, the idea that only Chinese people can be real Taoists, quote unquote. And then, of course, this involves a complex negotiation because if you're not ethnically Han Chinese, then do you have to make yourself culturally Han Chinese to kind of approximate that? And a lot of people are doing that. So trying to be Chinese culturally, even though they're not Chinese ethnically. And this also includes Orientalism. So Orientalism is this kind of exoticization of, in this case, Chinese culture, Taoism, but generally speaking, it's also Asian religion, Asian culture more generally. And so we have to be careful of both of these, right? We have to be careful of engaging in certain kinds of ethnocentric tendencies, but also Orientalist tendencies. Another problematic view is that Taoist identity requires knowing Chinese language. So this is complex. From my perspective, I'm going to go through this a little bit more in a moment. Chinese language, especially some kind of bilingual engagement with Taoism, is helpful for understanding Taoism and Taoist practice on a deeper level. Obviously for scripture study, because there are very few reliable English translations. We're primarily working in English, obviously, English translations of traditional Taoist texts, and then ritual. Another problematic view is that Taoist identity requires ordination and or lineage. So I've touched upon that. It doesn't, right? Most of the Taoists in Chinese history, including the founders of major Taoist movements, were not ordained and did not have lineage. So you could just think of Zhang Daoling, the founder of the Celestial Masters. Zhang Daoling wasn't a Taoist in this sense. The same thing is true of Wang Zhe, the founder of Chenzhen, Complete Perfection. So it's far more complicated, both historically and I think actually in terms of the larger community of Taoism. But in the modern world, you also have purchased ordination certificates without vocation or training. This is quite common. This involves identity construction, legitimation, commodification, or worse. So I think the kind of key thing here is, going back to my earlier point, is that being a Taoist priest or being a Taoist monastic is a vocation. And in a certain way, it's transpersonal, right? So thinking about the Tao as the sacred or ultimate concern of Taoists, it's beyond our individual identity. So ideally, ordained Taoist priests are being embodiments of the tradition, are helping to transmit it. This relates to looking at the roots versus the branches, the bones and marrow versus the skin. So obviously, I'm emphasizing the Tao, but I also think there are these values, there are these principles, there are these commitments that Taoists have. That's more about the root and the bones and the marrow than the branches and the skin. So the kind of superficial appearances of like hats and robes and things like this. Another problematic view is belief in the Tao is a sufficient condition for being a Taoist. As I said, that's more of a Taoist sympathizer. And one of the points here is that you could believe many things about the Tao that aren't necessarily Taoist. Okay, so going back to the kind of 4 characteristics of the Tao. And also all of the things that come with that, like how does one actually realize the Tao? How does one embody the Tao? And that requires obviously deeper practice and experience. The reason I put myself and the Daoist Foundation here is because I think it's like helpful, so not as an exercise in ego and self-promotion, but just to think through this kind of question of, okay, here's this person talking about the Taoist tradition, and how is he located, and how might this kind of inspire kind of more reflection? So this kind of opportunity for personal and communal inquiry. So what I want to say first is that I'm a scholar practitioner of Daoism. So I'm trained as a historian and also as a theorist, as you saw, primarily in religious studies. Some degree of sinification has happened, that I've spent a lot of time in China. I have a deep appreciation of traditional Chinese culture, Chinese aesthetics, Chinese art, Chinese architecture. We have the Daoist Studies Archive, so we have a lot of Daoist materials. Chinese language is really central. Most of my work is translating classical Chinese literature into English, obviously Daoist scriptures and things. That I'm ordained. I'm in a particular lineage, the Huashan lineage, the Mount Hua lineage of complete perfection Taoism. But then there's my own background, right? So this complex ethnocultural identity, I actually have 7 different ethnicities or nationalities in me. And so how do we kind of make sense of that, or how do we think about it? And it's like, well, there's somebody here in the contemporary United States who's part of this tradition, who's cultivating the Tao in modern America and thinking about these questions. The question of connection to Chinese Taoism as a source tradition, the possibility of global Taoism, that you can actually have a tradition-based Taoist organization and community in North America that's multicultural and multi-ethnic and so on. And that's inclusive, right? So the way I look at this is anyone and everyone can participate in the Taoist tradition, can do Taoist cultivation, can be a Taoist, quote unquote. And one point here is that because I have, quote unquote, all of these various supposed identity markers of authenticity, quote unquote, like a PhD, ordination, lineage, language skills, and so on. But since I'm simultaneously critical of these as necessary for being a Taoist, quote unquote, this might inspire sufficient pause. So yes, I've investigated all of these things from a lived perspective. I've maybe acquired them, right, as an actual individual. And in the process of investigating them, I've also kind of come to see how they're located in the tradition, how they may or may not represent some kind of authentic connection to the tradition. So what I really want to say to you here is Taoist being over being Taoist, right? That is, how do we cultivate ourselves in this deeper way? And this relates to Taoist view, practice, and experience, which I'll talk about more later. So then there's this, again, the question of language. This comes up a lot for people. Do I need to know Chinese? So I think the answer is yes and no, or depends on what you're trying to do, depends on your affinities and your aspirations. So there's a qualified relevance. Classical Chinese is the language of Taoist ritual, right? So this includes things like Tang pronunciations. I've had a lot of conversations with Michael Sassow, who's a senior scholar of Taoism and also one of the major experts on Taoist ritual. So certain kinds of ritual performances require using Tang pronunciations. Petition, so this is a kind of central aspect of Taoist ritual, involves using calligraphy and writing these out in Chinese. So you'd obviously have to know Chinese and usually classical Chinese. Classical Chinese is the language of Taoist scripture, so Dao Jing. So if you're going to read scriptures in their original, if you're going to translate them, you need to know classical Chinese. Classical Chinese as the basis of traditional Taoist art and aesthetics, and that includes calligraphy. So having Taoist aesthetics as part of Taoist community, Taoist place, right? Some people need to know classical Chinese, so we could have translators for other people. Also, Taoist names are based on traditional Chinese naming practices, so you don't need a Taoist name. You hypothetically, I guess, could have a Taoist name in English too that you use. But traditionally, there in Chinese, there's a surname, your Xing, and your given personal name, your Ming, that your family gives to you. Then you have what are called courtesy literary or style names, your zi, and you can have multiple ones of these. These can be self-given or other given. So you can almost think of these as like nicknames. You also have pen names or sobriquets, hao. And Chinese, in general, Chinese Taoists keep their family surname, so this is from a kind of traditional perspective, keep their family surname but change their given names, okay? So this is important. You maintain your connection with your ancestry, with your family surname, but you change your Ming, right? And you potentially even change your zi, yourself, the other given style names, to a Taoist name, right? And this is different from Ruists or so-called Confucians and Buddhists. Ruists keep their surname and their personal name, and also they'll have like style names, personal style names as well. But there's a much stronger sense of like retaining your ancestral relationships. In Buddhism, it's the other extreme. So obviously Buddhism is an indigenous Indian religion. So Buddhists change their surname and their given personal name. So if you take formal vows in Buddhism, you change your surname to Shi, Shakya, right? So that's the Chinese term for Shakya from Indian culture. And so Buddhists actually become part of the Buddhist family. And you also have religious names, Dao Hao or Fa Ming. So I'll just show you how this works, again, using myself as an example. My given Chinese name, so this was given to me by my first Chinese teacher, is Kang Si Qi. And you can hear that. That's a kind of transliteration of my last name, Komjathy, so it's about as close as you can get. Usually Chinese names, the surname is one character and the given name is two characters, but there are two-character Chinese surnames and there are single-character Chinese given names. And then self-given style names. So this is a name I gave myself early on in my practice, was Jing, Cultivating Stillness. So that's a self-given style name, and that's quite common in Taoist history. A lot of times people then add zi to this, which means master. But I think no self-respecting Taoist would add zi to their name in a modern context and say, I'm master cultivating stillness, although you have this teachers calling themselves masters and grandmasters or whatever. The reason I put you here is because you can do this. Right? So a lot of times these kinds of Taoist names are about things that you want to cultivate. They're reminders of what you're interested in or what your affinities are. But they also kind of tell us, right, some kind of quality that we ideally have. And then if we go into my ordination and religious names, Wan Rei, so these are bestowed by our master father, our Shifu, Chen Yuming. My Huashan lineage Taoist name is Wan Rei, Myriad Blessings. So that locates me as part of the so-called 26th generation. So it's based on the characters in the lineage poem of the Huashan lineage. And then Chang De, Constant Virtue, is technically from Qingjing Pai, the Clarity and Stillness lineage, and that's a more complicated story. So infrequently asked questions that should be asked. Yes, infrequently. So they're frequently asked questions. These are the infrequently asked ones, especially about being a Taoist, quote unquote. How does one develop a deeper connection with the sacred, the Tao? What type of practice is most beneficial? How does one follow a Taoist path and live a Taoist life? What are the most important Taoist principles and values? How does one recognize an authentic Taoist teacher? What type of training does one need for being a Taoist or to realize Taoist being? How does one become spiritually realized? So if we kind of broaden this out and look at the classical texts, and here we have LZ is Laozi, so the Tao Te Ching, and ZZ is the Zhuangzi. What do they tell us about kind of being a Taoist? So you have these kind of paradoxical and somewhat challenging statements in these texts. One who speaks does not know. One who knows does not speak. To know that you do not know is best. Not to know that you are knowing is sickness. My words are very easy to understand and very easy to practice, but no one understands them and no one practices them. Where can I find someone who has forgotten words and have a word with them? So you can see here this paradox, because it's how could one know if one's not speaking to someone who knows, right? But if those who speak don't know and those who know do not speak, then where are the teachings coming from? So if we go back to the earlier point about the teaching beyond words, we know the purpose of words, right? We know that our knowledge is limited. So one way to think about this is zhi, that here is being translated as know or knowing, and then this Taoist emphasis here on bu zhi, not knowing, or wu zhi, non-knowing, is that we recognize the limitations of our own understanding. We practice essential speech, so we're attentive to what we're saying. It's rooted in practice, so there's some kind of insight that comes through our speaking, but also there's a type of knowing, quote unquote, that we can think of as gnosis, spiritual or divine knowledge. And also that there is something that we practice. There's something that we seek to understand, right? That's beyond these kinds of constructs, or beyond this languaging, or beyond the ways that people talk about it. And the third one is really interesting, right? My words are very easy to understand and very easy to practice, but no one understands them and no one practices them. And so it sounds like it was over before it began, but clearly people did understand them and did seek to practice them, because we still have this text. So Taoism has a lot of these kinds of contradictions. And then just to conclude with another reflection that might help you is thinking about self-contextualization and auto-ethnography. So how each of us are located. And the reason ours in scare quotation marks is I don't know who you are. I don't know where you're located. I don't know how you self-identify. But thinking about your own context, thinking about your own location, thinking about your own identity, auto-ethnography also relates to your ethnocultural background, your ancestry, your larger community, and so on. And so I should really be saying my, right? Or use the first person. So being a Western American Taoist, so apparently being a Euro-American convert. And the reason I have apparently there is, of course, right? I've converted to Taoism, quote unquote, right? Around 20, let's say, maybe 22, depending on how you look at it. And clearly I'm not Chinese in terms of my ethnocultural background. But again, thinking about these larger sources of influence and connection. So there's that kind of question. So yes, sociologically, I'm a convert. I don't necessarily think of myself as a convert. We're members of global Taoism beyond Chinese Taoism, and this is non-hierarchical. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that, yes, you can think of global Taoism as coming out of Chinese Taoism as a source tradition, but you can also think Chinese Taoism as being inside of global Taoism. So that means the multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic aspect is a kind of egalitarian, inclusive model, right? That includes Chinese Taoists, and especially Chinese Taoists outside of mainland China. But we're Taoists together, right? From diverse backgrounds and from diverse communities, and thinking about being Taoists or Taoist being in the modern world. The Daoist Foundation mission, I put this here and also alluded to it earlier, is because if you heard it at the beginning, right? Fostering authentic Taoist study and practice, preserving and transmitting traditional Taoist culture. So yes, those are lofty ideals, those are lofty goals. But one of the things is to say that the tradition matters, right? So why do I care about tradition if I'm not a Chinese Taoist living in China? And it's because the Taoist tradition is profound and important on its own terms beyond ethnocultural identity, right? And then that is connected to traditional Chinese culture. In Taoism, we oftentimes refer to these things as Dao Jiao Wan Hua, Taoist culture. So there is something called Taoist culture, right? That's important to connect with, that's important to investigate, that's important to apply. But using an ecumenical and non-sectarian approach that is still tradition-based and religiously committed. So the reason I say this here is we tend to speak, and by we I mean the community of the Daoist Foundation and people associated with us, we tend to speak in a broad Taoist way. We tend not to go into movement-specific or lineage-specific viewpoints. Right? So technically we're located in the Huashan, the Mount Hua lineage of Quanzhen of complete perfection Taoism. I didn't mention before, but this as a monastic order is characterized by the three vows or the three commitments: celibacy, sobriety, and vegetarianism. So technically no sex, right? No intoxicants and no meat, or it's usually actually closer to veganism, so no animal products. And so what this means is that there's a stronger ascetic dimension to it, but we are more in a kind of householder approach with an ascetic dimension. And what that means then is a lot of the people in our community are following more of a householder path. So the specifics of Quanzhen or the specifics of Huashan may not be that relevant for most people. So we speak in these broader ways, in these more kind of general Taoist ways that are ecumenical. And that includes in relation to other traditions, but I'm talking specifically about Taoism here. The primary models that we use are contemplative, quietistic, and scholastic, including hermeneutical. So a strong emphasis on quietism, so silence and emptiness and stillness, but also kind of following this path of trust and acceptance, making our lives more about following the contemplative path, but with a study practice model. So that includes scripture study, and that's the hermeneutical. It's like reading Taoist literature together, discussing it, applying it, and so on. The secondary models are alchemical and ascetic. So alchemical meaning internal alchemy, so activating the subtle body, cultivating the subtle body, making ourselves more refined in terms of our energetic lives. Also ascetic, so renouncing kind of ordinary mainstream social reproduction and things like that. The three expressions, the san xian, so xian can also be pronounced jian to mean to see, which I'll talk about more at the next Lundao. But here, what I mean is the three manifestations, the three expressions of Taoist practice. So cultivation, embodiment, and transmission. The first two are more about Taoists in general. So any of us who are trying to follow a Taoist path, we're cultivating ourselves, we're trying to embody, or maybe not trying to embody, these principles, these commitments, these values, this attunement with the Tao. And then transmission is specifically the purview of elders, priests, monastics, right? These teachers, ideally, that is the people who are trying to help other people understand the tradition, follow this path. And then finally, I'll just say, we have this aspiration, and this isn't a self-promotion. This is, again, to bring attention to this issue or this possibility, this aspiration to have a Taoist retreat center and a quasi-seminary, so a training and translation center. So not just for us, but for the Taoist tradition more generally and Taoist community in North America, we need Taoist places, right? We need Taoist places with Taoist community, with tradition-specific Taoist aesthetics. So when you go to these places and you do practice, there's a whole kind of support system for getting into a kind of deeper level of cultivation and refinement. So thank you very much for listening to this Taoist Lundao. In the Taoist tradition, we usually say Dao Qi Changsun, may the Qi of the Tao be forever preserved, and then Cibei. And Cibei means compassion, but Taoists use it to say thank you. So Cibei, and stay safe and well.